in this lecture just to take several glimpses where I think some of the modern insights about the properties of fascia that have just come up in the last few years may have a clinical significance for us. Of course, Ida was one of the very first in modern manual therapy to emphasize the importance of fascia. More than any manual therapist, any somatic pioneer, she said you need to focus your attention not so much on muscle tonus, on cardiovascular things, on neural processes, but on the properties of fascia. And at her time, besides some osteopaths, for whom fascia was also one, but not exclusively, the number one tissue in the body, fascia was not taken to have such an importance there. And we live in very exciting times, because at the 2007 conference at Harvard Medical School, it happened that the scientific community really got shaken in a way where they realized, holy cow, we have been throwing this tissue away. We thought it is some stuffing and packing organ, and it plays a much bigger role. And we were sitting there in the auditorium, just Aline was there, several of you were there, with a sense of smile. We knew that all along, yeah. And the scientists are finally doing their homework, and we were applauding them. And that really, I thought, so there needs to be some applause for the knowledge that we already had. But these damn scientists have now taken our insights and have taken them even further. But let me share with you from that 2007 Congress, which was then later covered by very fortunate circumstances in the journal Science, which is #1 together with Nature in the academic world. And that article proved to be really a door opener for us. So if you want more recognition for your small Rolfing practice in the bigger community, don't go there with a Rolf Lines article or some fancy magazine. Go there with the science paper, because that opens door there. It's a 2-page article, and you can download it for free. Because in the academic world, it is not how many pictures you have, it is where you publish. So I have changed camps in the last 10 years. I know how academics think and what strange ethics they have. But there it's all about where you publish. And once you know that, you pick up that 2-page science paper, and suddenly they will say, wow, this is serious work, and when can we invite you to our hospital? We have an intervention. And you try it for 15 years. So these are some of the advantages for us that have come up from that Congress. But there was a special moment when we gave, where is the mouse? Whoops, here it is. When Richard Demerle stepped forward and said he wants to have the microphone, so I want to give him the word.
I think that this is one of the...
So that's Ida Rolf's son.
That my mother had been working for all her life. If she were here today, I don't know that she could handle the emotional component. It would be an overwhelmingness through disorder. She has worked hard. She has given her life to an ideal, to an idea, and fortunately today, this ideal, this dream that she had about the physical structure has come into a reality.
Okay, so the man to his right is Tom Findley, and he was one of the main reasons to put that Congress together. And for us, it is not something where Tom and Tom Myers and me and Eric Jacobson, where we can clap our shoulders. It was just a good idea at the right time, and then a huge element of luck coming additionally to it. And so in retrospect, the whole Congress has been a door opener for us. And as I said, we would be stupid not to run it. Other people, there is about 1,000 fascia therapists now in Germany, they are running into the fascia direction. And suddenly they call what they have been doing fascia therapy, they called it muscular therapy or something else before, and they're getting a lot of attention. Of course, Rolfing is more than working with fascia, but if we put the F word before, for good reasons, we have been doing that all the time, we will have doors opening and we don't need to bang at the doors because of these very good circumstances behind it. During the time when Ida was teaching, there were hardly any measuring methods for fascia. You had to trust your hands. And that is okay for complementary therapists to trust their hands. But for medical science, if Michelle is saying the right shoulder is stiffer than the left one, but you cannot measure it, they say, I look for another field of research. But that finally has changed. So now we can measure the thickness of fascia, the stiffness of fascia in minute details that were not possible 10, 15 years ago. And this is Peter Hying, and there was a moment at the 2007 Congress where we were suddenly not smiling, or we were smiling in a different way. Before he spoke, what we heard from the scientists was all stuff where you could say, I knew that before. But when he got up at the 2007 Congress and presented his research that he did on extramuscular force transmission, some of us got itchy. My teachers didn't tell me that. It would change my Rolfing practice if this guy is right. And actually, it has changed my Rolfing practice. So what he has done is you pull on one muscle, the tibialis anterior, which would lift the forefoot, and you measure of the 10 newtons you pull here, how many newtons arrive at the other end. In normal musculoskeletal anatomy, all of it should arrive. If you pull on the origin, the rest should arrive at the insertion, but not so much for your surprise. He found out about 30% of the force is lost into neighboring tissues because they are glued to each other. And his surprise was, even if the neighboring muscle is an antagonist, for example, the lateral head of the gastrocnemius, which is doing the opposite movement, then a significant portion of the force, of the muscular force, is transmitted not to the muscle fibers, but to the fascial envelope of the muscle. And that is important because he found out that most of the spastic paresis, so the cerebral palsy children, but also repetitive strain injury, is characterized that this force transmission to the antagonistic muscles is about twice as much as it is in healthy people. So even if you have the perfect Feldenkrais, Rolfing movement, neuromuscular education, where your brain finds exactly the right motor units to activate the tibialis anterior, then your gastrocnemius, not the muscle, but the fascial envelope, will stiffen against it. So you're all the time fighting against yourself, and your brain will not be able to help yourself. So what he now developed is a surgery where you go into the septum and loosen some of what could be crosslinks in between. And that's what he suggested to us. In my training, I looked for the stiffest portions on the muscle belly and tried to melt that. Now, after the 2007 Congress, I look for the groove. And I see whether I can deepen the groove in between and doing something similar as he's doing in the surgery there. So that was a surprise that he already presented in 2007. Now I met him 2 weeks ago, and he came up with another surprise, and it took him 8 years to take that field further because he wanted to know what is happening at that groove. Do you have more collagen fibers? Do you have crosslinks? Is the ground substance more gluey? And that would be important for us because you would work very different if you want to tear or open collagen fibers than if you want to do something else, for example, in there. And this is what he hasn't published yet. They looked at what collagen contents are changing when you experimentally induce a fibrotic pathology. So you develop something like spastic paresis in rats, and then you see, is the epimysium getting thicker? as we know it is after several years of a spastic contracture, is the endomusium getting thicker, that is enveloping, it's a fascial envelope around a single myofiber, or maybe the perimusium, which is enveloping several muscle fiber bundles. None of them has increased, but they got stiffer. They got this, except one layer of tissue which I didn't know exists. It is called the tertiary perimusium. Now, I hope you don't know what that is, so you're learning something. It is the connective tissue envelope around the neurovascular bundles. It is, I thought I had it is the perineurium, for example. We know that, let's go back, no, here we have it here. Oh, I thought I had, here we have it. So each neurovascular bundle is surrounded by a connective tissue sheet. And that is apparently where most of the fibrotic pathology start, before the muscle envelope thickens there. And this is very interesting because he also suggested that a lot of force transmission happens via these neurovascular bundles. And this is a new picture that I have here from animal dissections, where you see that some of our connective tissue membranes are done like a wing of a fly, in which the bundles have maybe 90% of the force transmission, and the very thin membrane is very, very thin and doesn't carry much force in between. And when you skin an animal, we found that also. When you, for example, behind the base of the neck, not only in humans, you cannot peel the skin off so easily. And we found that also in older rats. And when you have a region where you cannot peel the superficial fascia away from the fascia profunda underneath, it is usually that the gluing starts around these neurovascular bundles there. And that could be a support for the work that the Barral people are doing when they are manipulating not the membranous sheets, as Robert Schleip was doing for decades, but where they work with their fingertips to look for the bundles here. Because it is most likely an inflammatory pathology for whatever reason. We don't know it yet. But that would emphasize the work of the Australian Lorimer Mosley, the David Butler people, who are doing peripheral nerve manipulation, because that is an important place where the stiffening, before this layer glues together with that layer, it is not the flat places in between, it is these places where the fascia around a neurovascular bundle starts to get in some inflammatory gluing, adhesion, fibrotic pathology that you have there. And of course, that reminds us of the important research that Helen Langevin had already published before the 2007 Congress, in which she suggested that fascial manual therapists may be utilizing the same system as acupuncture is using, because the majority of the meridians and the acupuncture points is located at a place where you have a septum coming from the inside and then meeting the diving suit of the fascia profunda on the outside. Whereas a computer-generated accidental point most often lies at places where you don't have a septum coming out. So again, it would mean you work on the grooves particularly, and not only at the belly of the muscle. And of course, this is also where the neurovascular bundles are coming out. So the neurovascular bundles are hardly penetrating through the middle of the muscle. They are usually coming out here, here, and here. So this is a very nice support, but it's also opening my eyes. I will now learn where are the peripheral nerves, so I can palpate them. And I will have a book next to my table, just like the Barral people, just like the Australian people from peripheral nerve manipulation have been doing. This is Don Ingber. He was a superstar at the 2007 Congress because he had proven what we haven't done yet for the large body, but he has proven for the cell that you can understand the mechanics of the cell only as a tense equity structure. and he's pretty much accepted that. Of course, Rolfers and other pioneering people are applying that to the hip joint, to the spine, etc. And we may be right, but we haven't proven it yet. But the tensegrity model, a couple of months ago, is taking up a new career now, because the NASA is now exploring how to use tensegrity structures for missions on the planet Mars in the future. So again, be prepared. The tensegrity will be very popular in the future. There should be sound.
So the initial inspiration was to put one of these toys because what can we use them for? Well, they make them as baby toys because they're really safe, hard to break them, hard to hurt yourself with it, hard for a baby to hurt themselves with it. And you can throw it on the ground really hard, you're not going to break it. You're like, hey, that's a landing robot. We were using tensegrity structures, which are these tensile networks that are very shock absorbent, pliant, and we're using those to build robots or planetary landers that can land on another planet, absorb that impact shock, and then that very same structure is your robot that enables mobility on the planetary surface. So why, as engineers, would we care about these types of structures? As you interact with the environment, you have different forms of interaction. I want to pick something up. I want to walk across the terrain. The stiffness of your structure ends up having a very direct impact on your efficiency, your effectiveness, how you respond to things. And so being able to tune that stiffness and either make it stiffer or floppier is one of the sort of holy grails of modern robotics. And these types of structures enable that by changing the overall tension of the structure. You can turn it from being very stiff to being very floppy. This was one of the first mobile prototypes that we built, and it was really designed for motion. You can just sort of see how robust it is. We can eventually suspend a reasonable mission-relevant payload in the middle. The real challenge here is we've broken all the rules of traditional robotics design. A lot of those design approaches just don't work with this robot. How do you sense its shape? How do you sense its forces? How do you actually control it? How do you have power and information communicated through this whole structure? And so just that sort of basic engineering principles is a big part of what the research we've had to do is. Tensegrity robots is a fascinating new direction for robotics. There's really interesting properties here to unlock, but it's a hard problem.
Okay, they haven't decided yet, but the chances are very high that in the next mission to another planet, they will use one of these icosahedron that we have been familiar with all along. So this is an exciting field, and we can then say we were the first to apply tensegrity to the macroscopic large body in general. And also it has some very interesting consequences for movement orchestration, the discussion how much tonus is good, should you relax more, should you stiffen more, for which kind of sports attitude, etc. So this is very helpful. To see the human body as a tensional network in which the organs and bones are suspended as isolated spaces in between. A couple of months ago, the first atlas on the human tensegrity fascial system has been published. After 400 years, this is a historic piece in anatomy. And Terminologia Anatomica is rewritten. It will be published in September, and it will include a lot of the insights. No matter how fast we will accelerate, already one fascia therapy has surpassed us in terms of their scientific evidence. We used to be the leaders in scientific research, and other manual therapists copied us and tried to swim in our shadows. And now the Stecco method has made a huge contribution to the field, so I advocate us to swim together with them and give them some advice once in a while, but what they have done is huge for the anatomical exploration. So now we have, for the first time, an atlas of the fascial system. We never had that. And the book is really opening doors. I highly recommend it. There is also a German edition now out there, particularly the clinical pearls, which are embedded through this book there. And what Carla Stecco and her brother Antonio Stecco found out is that there are certain places in the fascial network where you have a very high proprioceptive innervation density. And if you are working with fascia, not only as a piece of meat, but to make a hopefully lasting connection or stimulatory connection to the brain, these would be high potent places, because you don't have time to work on every square millimeter with the same attention. And to my surprise, for example, the lacertus fibrosus, which is a membranous attachment of the biceps brachii, it carries a lot of force, much more than we thought in the past, but in terms of proprioceptive innervation, it is very poor. So they found that fascial membranes who have a lot of force transmission are very poor in proprioceptive innervation. Whereas on the other end, you have retinacular sheets that go perpendicular to the main force transmission, and you can cut them away, and you don't change much of the force transmission. I thought I need the retinaculum so my tendons wouldn't jump out. You can cut the retinaculum away, and the tendons stay there, because they have their own envelopes who are glued to each other. So these retinacular tissues are less important for mechanical stability and reinforcement, but they have a very high innervation with proprioceptive, mostly stretch receptors that we have there. So that would be important for us, not only to talk with surgeons, how can I get the proprioceptive sliding ability back there, but also on which places would I work there. And I've been running around Germany and other countries and telling fascia is a sensory organ, etc. But one of my closest collaborators, Professor Menze from Heidelberg University, he picks me every few months and said, Robert, this sounds very nice, your fascia as a sensory organ. But in his extensive studies of the various layers of the lumbar fascia, he has only found one Ruffini ending so far. And he isn't even sure of that. And I want to stuff him and shut up, I don't want to hear that. But of course, that is not good science. So he has mostly looked in these membranous layers there, but he should find more than one Ruffini ending if the lumbar fascia is an important element of your proprioceptive self-sensing there. He found lots of nociceptive or potentially nociceptive nerve endings in there, and some of them could be proprioceptive. We know free nerve endings can have a proprioceptive function, but nevertheless it is surprising. So now we have a study going. We don't know the results yet. It is happening in Leipzig University with Hanno Steinke, where we look, could there be also a retinaculum of the lumbar fascia? And if you go up in your anatomy, yes, there is one. The serratus posterior inferior. This is usually a question in the exam to make people feel inferior. Yeah, it is a very small muscle, and it is supposed to be a breathing associated muscle, which it's not. If you go in the literature, you find it has no association with breathing. Neither in EMG when people breathe, nor in any of the asthmatic pneumonia pathologies that are breathing related. So it has a different function. So it goes from the lower ribs towards the spinous processes, and mostly it is a fascial membrane with very thin, short muscle fibers. And it could be a mobile retinaculum that we have there. So my hope, if I want to continue to say fascia is a sensory organ and we need to work with it, is that in this layer you find the same high density of proprioceptive nerve fibers as you found in the retinaculum. We have retinacular fibers at other places of the body. It's usually 1 or 2 inches away from the major joints where you have muscular tendons passing perpendicular directions under it. So this is something where I don't know yet the result, but it's definitely an interesting dissection. Where do we have retinacular fibers if you want to emphasize proprioception in the system? In the future, I would think that every 4th, every 5th Rolfer will have an ultrasound if we meet again in 5 years. So far, for very good reasons, you and I don't have ultrasounds. It is these white machines that look cold, and they come in with a cold gel, and it's all about the white coat and all of that. But the ultrasound now is getting into tablet size, and they have a warm gel, and it has a resolution of 1/20th of a millimeter. And then you can do fascia research with it. And based on that ultrasound examination, we now have a new hypothesis, which is not yet completely clarified, but more and more people find it convincing, is that some of the stiffening that we palpate with our hands may be a fibrotic stiffening. So this is, for example, here the epimysium, the fascial envelope of the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which would be very easy to get an ultrasound head on. And normally the envelope is only like 1 millimeter thick, but if you have fascial neck pain, not if you have muscular neck pain, then the epimysium will be 2 millimeters thick. But maybe you don't need an ultrasound because you can palpate. Is the envelope of the sausage stiff, or is the content of the sausage stiff? Of course, it feels different if you do a small indentation, but we also have tools now to look at that. So that would be a fibrotic change that took months because collagen is a slow renewal system. However, there are also conditions of stiffening in which not the total collagen content has increased, but a layer of the ground substance which is very rich in hyaluronan. And I used to think hyaluronan is good because of the cosmetic industry, and it makes you look younger, and because it binds water. So normally hyaluronan is good. It makes the tissues more lubricant. However, if you have too much hyaluronan, it becomes a glue, and then it forms these supermolecules. And this is apparently happening at the beginning of some of the stiffening processes, where you didn't have time to have new collagen, but you have a glue in between. And Tom Findlay, who you saw there, together with Antonio Stecco, they are now doing Rolfing manipulations with an ultrasound head. So you put the same amount of force per square centimeters on the IT band, and you look, is this layer changing its thickness and its consistency? And it seems to be, but we don't know it yet, that our pressure, particularly if it's in a shearing diangle, so it's not squeezing you vertically, but it's squeezing away of you. Then where you have shearing motion, then you transform some of the superglue molecules of hyaluronan into more liquid molecules, and that could be done in a matter of 30 seconds, 40 seconds, so you don't need months for that change. So this is something that would be a plausible model to explain the short-term effects that we have in Rolfing manipulation and similar models. Most of you know that Tom Myers has taken our system of myofascial force transmission and made a very convincing concept of it, particularly because he also knows how to appeal to the media, and we can learn a lot. Fancy pictures are very important. And since he did his myofascial trains in blue, it is even more successful. And people are taking it as a gospel. You know, is this the spiral line and which one? And we were there, Peter Schwind, we were there when he developed them as a game, as examples of myofascial force transmissions. But now people take it as a gospel. And that is what is happening with gurus. Now, since we have science, you can test them. So this is a few months ago. Jan Wilke from the Sports University in Frankfurt, he has done cadaver tests about some, not all of his transmission lines. And good for Tom, 3 of the lines have a very high evidence-based substance. So if it's about sharing newtons, if you pull here how many newtons arrive, passive force transmission, then the superficial back line, which I'll look at in a minute because it's very important for low back stability, really is not a matter of believing. It is something that you can measure in people. The same thing for the functional back line or also the functional front line. However, no matter how convincing you find it, the superficial front line doesn't have a passive force transmission base. It may still happen for you, but then it may be a neuromuscular coupling. My favorite example is if I have to open a jar and I cannot open it, I squeeze my anus. I also tighten my jaw. But this is a neurological coupling up here. You don't need a connection from the hand turning to my anus in order to explain it. It is not a passive force transmission. So if you want to get me to open jars without cutting my anus, please work on this and don't work on some supposed fascial lines that you have there. So this is also my explanation about the superficial front line, but also of the lines that I liked very much. The spiral line, yes, there is a basis above the pelvis, but below the pelvis, it is not convincing. So please get updated on that, so it's not your client who tells you that you are still on the stage of 5 years ago and that this is no longer true. Some of these lines are now really very much in detail looked at when it comes to low back stability and potential contributions for low back pain. This is the functional back line, which is the first layer of the lumbar fascia here. You see these old German anatomy books, Raube-Kopsch, 1912. If you have any of them there, get your hands on them and protect them and put them in a vault, because the Steckos are buying them up and translating them into Italian or English language, because they had a very detailed anatomy there. So this would be the first layer. Some of you know that already. If you want to work on the first layer of the lumbar fascia, the prayer position is ideal for the client, but also in everyday life, because you have the gluteus maximus in a maximum force transmission, and you can put the arms forward, and then the muscles can relax. So in the prayer position or the child's position, it is an ideal position to look for possible tightening and gluing in the first layer. But you can peel that off with a knife and look at the second layer underneath, and that doesn't cross the midline, most of the fibers, and that would be the superficial front line in Tomeyer's system, where you have a significant amount of the fibers of the biceps femoris not attaching at the ischial tuberosity, as you learned for the exam, but they say, no, I don't follow the exam, I go directly into the sacrotuberous ligament. And for you, it could be 30% of the fibers. For you, it could be 40% of the fibers. And that may explain why certain exercises work more for one or the other person. And that would go all the way up into the Galea aponeurotica. So I use that usually for seated back work, in which the client is straightening their neck and using the neck into this, but not so much the rotation that you have in there. That was known to some of you. But now, a year ago, Andre Fleming and Frank Willard, who are the leaders in the fascial exploration there, they are looking at a third layer of the lumbar fascia that I hardly knew anything about, but it may be the most important one. It attaches at the transverse processes, not the spinous processes, this being a vertebral body, erector spinae here. And the two layers that I just looked at, they attach here, but there is a third layer which you cannot palpate so easily, and it takes long needles to get there, which is twice as thick as both of these superficial layers together. So most likely it is at least as important as both of these superficial layers together. And it is basically controlled by the transverse abdominis. And then, of course, you should think about segmental stability, inner unit, powerhouse, mula bandha, all of that work that was originally coming from Australia, where we know that the transverse abdominis has a very intimate relationship to back stability, but also to low back pain and to psychological components. But I used to think that this is basically a muscular problem. But the transverse abdominis, even if you have it functioning very well, it is basically a membrane tightener. And if the membrane is not in the right geometry, you can do thousands of hours of Pilates training, core stability, etc., because the transverse abdominis needs this membrane to share the force in the right direction. And there is a very important place that now gets a lot of attention in the last year. It used to be called the lateral raphe with PH. It's a sewing line. And they used to think it's a letter V, but it's actually a triangle. It's a closed space, and Hanno Stecko found a lot of nerves in them. And we don't know exactly what the nerves are doing. But in an ideal body, it should be a mobile switch. If you have a low load to carry, if you are putting up a backpack, then it is sufficient if the transverse abdominis tightens and gets 80 or 100% of the force through the transverse process. But if your daughter wants to ride on your shoulders and you're not sure if you are strong enough to do that, you should pre-activate the erector spinae, not isolated contraction as the Pilates people have been doing. You should do bracing, and then the pre-activation of the erector spinae makes a pumping effect where it pulls the switch here a few millimeters forward and to the side, and then 50% of the stabilizing force goes to the spinous process and 50% goes to the transverse process. And you can say, where is my other daughter? Because you are twice as strong before any collagen fiber breaks because of lack of training or whatever. So this is an important area for us to look at, because they found out that in many couch potatoes, this switch is no longer functioning because it's glued. So now in my Rolfing practice, I try to work at this area, which is exactly the lateral border here, and that's also where you have most of the hernias. You know that people have hernias, not only at the front of the body and the inguinal hernia, but also they are documented places of low back hernias, and it's usually at this lateral raphe that is there. The new name of it is LIFT, lumbar interfascial triangle, so that is a new name for that. Low back pain will be filling our practices, most likely, particularly when we have a clear test. We don't have a clear test yet, we only have indications. But maybe in 2 years, when somebody has low back pain, they will do ultrasound, they will do examinations, they may do biopsies and say, this one needs a good fascia therapist. This one doesn't, he needs a psychotherapist or a muscular therapist. But it is now quite clear that a substantial amount, I don't give you a number, of low back pain where the driving factor are not the disc, it's something else. And in many, it could be an irritation, an injury, an edema in the lumbar fascia, and we need to find out in which layer and who is good and knowledgeable to work with that. Here are some indications to recognize whether the fascia is responsible for the low back pain or whether it's only a minor contribution. They did the gold standard in pain research now, which is injection of hypertonic saline solution. If you add that with ultrasound, so I inject a small amount of sterile saline solution either into your erector spinae muscles or into the lumbar fascia or into the skin, and then I pinch you and I ask you questions, depending on whether you got low back pain, muscular pain, or you got fascial low back pain. And one thing is interesting, a muscular low back pain is more punctual. The client can show with their index finger, it is here. It is, no, Robert, go 1 inch further down. Whereas if they have fascial low back pain, they hardly put the finger there, they go with the whole flat surface there, which in my practice is a majority of the clients. So if they are having that regional spreading where they cannot pinpoint, but in which it's a broad surface like that, that is not proof, but it's an indication that this could probably be congruent with a fascial low back pain. There is a second one, which was a surprise for me. If you ask people who have muscular low back pain, please describe your low back pain. You have a questionnaire, is it hot, is it cold, etc. They usually describe it with very neutral words like hot, piercing, skinning, burning, etc. Whereas the people who have fascial low back pain, they additionally use some adjectives which have an emotional suffering quality. It's a cruel pain. It is a mean pain. And that is very uncommon in people who have muscular low back pain. So in many of my clients, I find that. So when people have low back pain, they change their character. When they had knee pain, some of them, not all of them, they take it with a German sports-like attitude, no pain, no gain, and I have learned to live with it, and blah, blah, blah. But when they have low back pain, suddenly they become a self-pitying wimp. Poor me, and I don't deserve this, and they start to sigh when they come into your living room. If that's part of their character, don't blame fascia on it. You know, it's a whole, they have been doing that with other body parts too. But if that is unusual, if you ask the wife, you know, was your husband like this before? No, usually he takes things with a positive attitude, but since he has that low back pain, he is becoming worse than his father is. Then that may be a second indication. Of course, both of these indications are not sufficient to tell us whether that is low back pain or not, but we are moving there. And finally, before I come to a closure and maybe even some questions, one of the future fields, and there was a conference in November, may be oncology. Whether you get, so 1/3 of us, we will die of cancer, and 2/3 of us, we will die of something else before cancer gets us. So cancer is very prominent the older our society gets, and usually fascia is not the prime reason for getting cancer. But, and this is new, whether the cancer gets you before something else gets you, there fascia plays a major role, because even if you have an aggressive cancer, but if the fascial environment is gentle and soft, it will behave less aggressively. That has been shown in many experiments in the last 2-3 years. You take some very aggressive cancer cells and you put them in a compliant, in a soft connective tissue matrix, and they behave quite well. Particularly because your immune system uses the thin collagen fibers, the type 3 fibers, as a roadmap to get to the cancer and to keep it down. Whereas if due to the growth of the cancer, you have more collagen type 1, and we used to think that this is a protection capsule, yes, it protects the cancer from you and from your surviving, wanting to survive immune system. So then the immune system cannot get there. It creates a breeding situation, and even cancer that has genetically not so potent qualities will become almost deadly afterwards. So now there is a huge hunt for anti-fibrotic therapies. And of course they are looking for biochemical means. So far we only found biomechanical means. And that's what Helen Lorgever, she has shown that with rats, that static yin yoga-like stretching has an anti-fibrotic quality. So if I had stomach cancer or lung cancer, I don't know about prostate cancer, I would do 10-minute stretches in a yin yoga style, not to get more flexible, but in order to live longer, to prevent the stiffening of that. Now, this is new. In research, you don't need to torture humans and animals anymore. In some of the cases, you have bioengineered tendons in which the computer takes collagen from dead meat and puts it into an artificial tendon, and then you populate it with living fibroblasts, for example, from a piece of your skin. And you nurture them that they make this artificial tendon their new home. And then you come with a knife and put an injury in there, but you're not torturing an animal. Nevertheless, the cells will try to do what they are specialized on, wound closure, and you can see how is the wound closing. This is a gray line under natural conditions. And you see already after 48 hours, the wound has closed 30%. Now what you can do here, and there is no placebo effect or anything else involved, you do gentle stretching of the bioengineered tendon, and you see that the longer you do the stretch, the more rapid the wound closure is happening. This is so they did 1 minute up to 5 minutes of gentle stretching they did, and you got a more rapid wound closure in there. So if I would go for surgery, I would do these gentle stretches, but then it took them another few months to find out at what magnitude And there it was the opposite. The gray line is here. If you do a 12% stretch, and I know already then you have some tearing in some of the fibers. Of course, the wound healing is delayed. It is worse than before. But the most gentle stretch, 3%, which is just at the beginning of the linear increase zone, so it's at the end of the neutral zone, had the most potent effect on these injuries. Last slide, and then I'm finished. In the future, you may use Rolfing and Rolfing-like stimulations as a preventative medicine. And Geoff Bove, who was one of the main presenters at all of the last congresses, he made rats to slaves where they had to do secretary work. So he gave them very few food, so they were half-starved, and then they learned a complicated hand movement to get them food pellets. Of course, they do that complicated movement with the hand a few thousand times a day, just like your secretary clients are doing, and they're getting repetitive strain injury. But some of his slave secretary rats got a Rolfing-like treatment at the same time as doing the slavery work, and they cope much better. So in the brave new world where you get people into boxes and make them work as slaves, you would get them a Rolfing treatment additionally, so you can exploit them more fully, because they can work more 1,000 hours a day and still not have inflammatory overuse signs here. And let me actually show you, where is the, it's here. So this is science with rats. You can do rat massage, or I don't know if you call it Rolfing. Okay, those rats who got once a day this gentle fascia-oriented massage, they had less overuse injuries, still by doing the same slavery work as opposed to the others. Now, those of you who feel like Rolfing slaves sometimes, because you're doing too many sessions, I would use for something like that. A foam roller is not as good as Geoff hands are, but it may be better than having nobody doing gentle mechanical stimulation under your skin there. And this is Kobe Bryant. He was the #1 basketball player until recently. And I was accompanying his manual therapist, who unfortunately is not a Rolfer, but he works very much like old-fashioned Rolfers, to give him a 2.5-hour treatment on the day before a big game. And he has not yet published that. They have less overuse injuries if you give them an old-fashioned, strong, painful, preparatory treatments in the days before. And you probably activate the fibroblast to have a more active metabolism, so when injuries happen, they are already ready. They know how to repair it. So if I would have a surgery next week, if I would run a half marathon next week, I would go to the most brutal old-fashioned Rolfer there is. Or I would go on a foam roller and listen to some heavy metal music and try to bruise myself, which is for me impossible, but some of you may be doing that. But I would do that 5 days earlier. And then maybe on the day before, I would do Sharon's featherlight stroking. So you activate the fibroblast. And when then the injury happens in your marathon, in your big hike that you're doing, or the surgery comes, you probably have a bigger, a faster repair that you have there. So that's also a future for us. I don't know if that is medicine or wellness, but people who want to have a more healthy body, they will use Rolfing-inspired methods to prevent overuse injuries, and not only to come to your treatments when they had these. Thank you very much, and I think we have some minutes for questions.